Hello everyone. I'll briefly introduce myself. I've been around crypto since the early 2010s. I did a PhD at a business school called INSEAD, started 2011 and then finished 2017. The reason why that's relevant is because the dissertation was on organizational theory. What does that mean? It means that my interest was less in how crypto can help us develop assets like money and help us replace things like the government, but more how crypto can help us develop new types of organizations, such as DAOs. So what I'm going to talk about today is a way of looking at DAOs that I hope you haven't looked at before, right? That's number one. Number two, I will make radical oversimplifications that I hope are interesting, but I hope trigger kind of conversation for the rest of the day. So the first thing that's interesting is that there's a story of this guy called Konrad Lorenz. In 1934, he wrote a piece of paper that summarized an experiment that he did with ducklings, right? So right after these ducklings hatched, the first thing that they looked at, they tended to follow it for the rest of their lives. So it's really, really interesting, right? So some other guys comes along, Heinrod, which was his thesis supervisor, also a very well-known scientist, he did the same experiment with gray-lag goslings. The first things after birth that they observed, they tended to follow for the rest of their lives. So this is interesting. Check this out. A duckling that saw not his mother upon birth, or her mother, upon birth, but instead saw a balloon, they would follow the balloon for the rest of their life. So they were attached to the balloon, not the mother. Kind of interesting, right? Another thing that happened, it wasn't just a balloon, it was a cardboard box. Or it was the experimenter as opposed to the actual mother. And so what we see is that there are these early periods when something is created that have a very long-lasting and persistent effect over the rest of time. And the story is interesting because I think the same is true for DAOs. Right now, DAOs are sort of being created, and we're trying to figure out what it is that we're attaching ourselves to. Now, hopefully it won't be balloons or cardboard boxes or experimenters or kind of duckling mothers, but there will be something more meaningful, right? And so my goal today is to sort of talk about what some of these things might be. And so the first insight is that what is an organization as opposed to an aggregation of individuals, right? So for example, what Justice talked about was very interesting because it was a discussion about how individuals in a system kind of coordinate. But what's really organizational about that, right? Like what distinguishes an organization from just a random group of strangers going to a rave party? I don't think we would call that typically an organization, right? The classic case that we take in crypto is the idea of the sovereign individual, which is a great book you have the book with you, right? Right, so I would love to read a book that talks about the sovereign collective. And how is the sovereign collective different from a story about the sovereign individual or a story about sovereign individuals, right? And so there's a number of answers, there's a number of ways that we can think about that. The first one is an organization as a legal construct, right? Which is very prevalent today. So let's talk about that for a while. An organization as a legal construct has a separate legal personality, separate from all the individuals that are within the organizations, right? We have a legal personality that is our passport, to make it simplest. So if I want to sue you, I saw Ivan specifically, right? But how do I sue a group of Ivan with his friends? I cannot unless it has a legal personality. Now that's kind of good if I want to sue him, but it's also good for him because if he has a personality as a collective construct, he can go raise money. This organization can go to a bank, although the thing doesn't really exist, right? It exists on paper, and it can borrow money. It can enter contracts with individuals, it can enter contracts with other organizations. So a collective, let's think about it, a sovereign collective is separate from just an aggregation of individuals. So when we think of DAOs, we shouldn't always reduce all of our explanations to the incentives and motivations of individuals. There must be something bigger than that, something organizational, right? If you don't do that, you end up in a number of problems like DAO recently did, right? Which is people voting in a DAO where you don't have a separate legal personality. Then you have certain states, in this case the US government, that comes after you and says, you guys are at fault for something that went wrong, which is literally what happened,
right? So I don't know about you guys, but just voting on something, I'm one of the heaviest users of snapshots since the beginning, right? I vote less now than I used to vote before if the group that I'm part of doesn't have a separate legal personality, because I don't want to get sued. Not that I have any money, right? But like I don't have anything to give. So sovereign individuals versus a sovereign collective. An organization has a separate legal personality. Today in the space, we don't really have separate legal personalities for DAOs. We kind of try to engineer those in various ways, right? There's the holy trifecta, right? You do a foundation somewhere in an offshore location, you have the personal development company that kind of gets hired, and then you kind of do a little contractual legal acrobatics, and you hope that it kind of keeps you fine, which in substance, everyone knows that it's probably not quite the right approach, but it's something that follows the idea of progressive decentralization. Now, progressive decentralization is interesting because when it was originally written, it was a product management strategy. You would start out developing a product, and then if you wanted to hand it over to the community, you want to progressively decentralize by creating a DAO, right? And your hope is that the DAO eventually takes over all the development of that product. But what it's effectively turned to, if you think about it, when we talk about progressive decentralization, it's not as a product management strategy anymore. It's a legal strategy. How do you not become liable if you are a team that raised $5 million in your seed round at 50? Well, maybe not anymore. Maybe now it's like 2 and 20, right? If you raise $2 million at a 20 million valuation, how do you make sure you don't end up in jail? Progressive decentralization, right? I mean, quite literally, this is kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. So again, I'm taking you back to the point of not about sovereign individuals, but how do we create these things that are collectives? There's a legal component to that, and one of the ways of thinking about this is in terms of the things I just discussed. There's sort of another way of thinking about collectives, which is, why are we creating organizations on-chain as opposed to just organizations too cool, right? A PT, LTD in Singapore, an LLC in the US, an AG if you're in Switzerland or Germany. Why are we creating these organizations on-chain? There must be something really unique or something really useful about doing things on-chain, because otherwise, why the hell are we doing it? And so my question kind of back, when often DAOs, so as Capital Ventures, right, we see a lot of different deals. And people come and they say, oh, we're doing a DAO, and I'm like, why don't you just do a normal organization? And for that, I think the core difference to me between a DAO and a normal organization is that some stuff is on-chain. And to be very clear, Coca-Cola or Lacoste doing a little NFT collection on-chain doesn't turn Lacoste into a DAO. Lacoste is still a traditional organization doing some on-chain experiments. So when I say that a DAO has an on-chain component, what I mean is that the essential activity, the core of that DAO, must have dependence on on-chain stuff, right? Not just an NFT contract for Coca-Cola. That's not a DAO, right? Even if you do a PFP project out of it, right? Even if you use a Moloch contract, right? Even if, that's just not it. So a DAO is something where its core activity is tied to on-chain things. Okay, I'm oversimplification, but like a DAO is an organization that has an on-chain element that is core to its activities. So why would you do that? Why do we do things on-chain? So throughout the day, I had a couple of discussions, and people said, well, transaction costs are lower. Transaction costs in the Coasian sense. Talk from an academic perspective where, Ronald Coase in his early 1930s paper, he identified 4 different types of transaction costs, which, let's be very clear what they are so we can understand how DAOs, in my opinion, do not reduce transaction costs and in fact increase them. So the 4 of them were search costs. So why do individuals create organizations as opposed to interacting with each other in economic exchange? Because if I want to find someone who can help me do PR in this room, that's a huge cost in searching for that person. I have to go to each one and find who's doing PR, maybe who's not doing PR, who's a developer, who's doing... There's search costs involved with that you don't necessarily have in an organization, because if I have a PR department, a marketing department inside, I know exactly where to go, right? There's also bargaining costs. So a big problem that we have and why we do organizations as opposed to interacting freely as individuals in a market is that organizations have fixed rates. Meaning, if I go to my developer department, everyone's kind of paid with, everyone has a salary, and if I tell them they need to do something, they do it by fiat in the sense of hierarchy. Right? Whoever is your manager, and that's your job, and you're supposed to do that. Versus if I have to find a developer in the free market, I have to bargain with that person. How long are you going to work? What happens if you don't finish the work, right? How much do we need to pay you for your services, and how much do you want, right? And then we have to negotiate on a whole bunch of stuff. So transaction costs are quite high in this academic sense for doing DAOs, right? But there's a much more practical sense, which is if you deploy a DAO today, not in an L2 but in an L1, the transaction cost is just really, really high, Ethereum being the traditional example. And so, again, I'm kind of asking, why are we doing organizations on-chain? They don't have a legal identity today. We're trying to kind of tag that on somehow, but some people don't think that's DAOs, right? Like Gabe Shapiro. So organizations on-chain don't have a legal liability, so we're all exposed to huge liability to our personal assets. And then at the same time, transaction costs are really high. I mean, quite literally, right? But also theoretically. So why are we doing DAOs? Why are we doing DAOs? So we kind of have to go back to what's the benefit of doing things on-chain. So here's one of the great things that I think is super cool about DAOs. So I was recently at DAO Harvard, and Lauren Lessig, who I suppose most of you know, wrote a book that kind of described this idea of what happens once we move from the real world to the digital world. So one of the big benefits, he said, was you can have continuous auditability. By continuous, you can literally think every single second. Now, we can argue, what should you be auditing within an organization? The most obvious one is money flows. Right? Let's make it quite simple, right? So I run a couple of venture capital funds, for example, and they have to get yearly audits. Like, what did you do with the money that you received? Did you buy yourself a Lambo or 2 or 3, right? Or did you actually deploy that into investments? And so money flows need to be audited. But things that happen on chain, you don't just have to audit money, because the things we put on chain aren't just DEXs and DeFi assets. They're also things like what kind of decisions get made. So what can you do with a continuous auditing of decisions? Well, sometimes you want to know how a certain decision is made, and sometimes you don't want to know. I don't want to go into touchy subjects, but continuous auditability is something that I think is very, very unique for on-chain organizations that we cannot replicate in organizations that are off-chain. And you have to think for when that's really useful, right? We could talk about examples for that, but I want to jump to the next point, right? So why should you not use DAOs? Don't use it for legal reasons. Bad idea, right? When should you not use DAOs? Probably not if you want to rely mostly on individuals bargaining a lot and you want hyper efficiencies, right? You want to do things on-chain when you want continuous auditability. Now, here's another reason that's very popular in our space. A lot of people say, Aragon, in fact, has it in its original constitution, which is unstoppable organizations. Now, what does that really mean, right? It means, quite literally, you cannot stop an organization, but who wants to stop an organization, and when does that sort of happen? So if we think that a DAO is better than a traditional organization because it's unstoppable, when do we need an organization to be unstoppable? And, we know what the average policymaker thinks about that, right? There's certain organizations you want to stop, but you just can't stop, and so they're trying to stop it, and we don't just want to produce these kinds of organizations, right? We don't do one for nefarious purposes. We want to do the ones for good purposes. And so what I'm trying to tell you here is that we can have these properties about when to DAO and properties about when not to DAO, but the properties themselves are not enough. We must also give examples about when an organization is unstoppable, that is good for the world because of X, right? When an organization has continuous auditability, that is good because of X, right? When an organization doesn't have a legal veil of protection, that is good because of X. I don't know when that would be good, but maybe that is good, right? And so I want to end now with one example about DAOs that I don't think is talked about a lot, but that could be quite interesting for you guys to think about. And that's the idea that a DAO can change the locus of trust. Here's what I mean. If you think about Bitcoin, everyone says that it's about trust minimization. I think that's plainly false. Why do we use Bitcoin? And if you think Bitcoin is kind of like a new monetary system, what is it that we believe in? That trust has been minimized, but trust in what has been minimized? We don't have to believe in the US, the Federal Reserve, which is a bunch of old dudes, mostly dudes, some women too, right? Who kind of decide about supply, about the monetary system. And we don't really know how they make the decisions and what their goals are, but they kind of make these choices that kind of affect everyone else, right? So we don't have to trust these guys anymore, and instead we trust in code. Now that sounds kind of familiar, trust in code. And I agree, right? Don't trust, verify. But if we trust in code, then we're not minimizing trust. We're changing the locus of trust. We're not trusting people, we're trusting code. But I'm not sure if we're trusting code less than we trusted people before. I think a whole lot of people, I mean, really quite practically, probably 80% of people in this room, just trust that the code will work well without even having ever looked at it. Yeah, I'm not trying to diss anyone, I'm just saying that's how it is. You know, my mom will never look at it, right? My dad will never look at it. Some of my best friends in crypto just have never looked even at the repos, right? Or at BIPs. They never even read them, right? And so when we're changing the locus of trust, DAOs are interesting. And it's for the following reason. I'll give you a very simple one before I finish. It's the example of universities. So my university came to me after I graduated around 2016 and was like, oh, Rolf, so you're talking about all this like crypto stuff and tokens and like something around organization we don't understand, but we hear that a lot of money is being made. First of all, do you want to make a donation? No, I was on scholarship, right? No, number one. Number two, I don't have money, right? I never do, right? Number three, I suggest that instead of asking for money, the university creates a DAO. They were like, what the hell? What are you talking about, right? And I said, look, think this through. After I graduated in 2017, a lot of people knew me because I had been teaching at various universities around the world about this stuff that everyone thought I was crazy. And I graduate, crypto markets go up, everybody's interested. So my university's alumni start calling me up. Current students call me up, saying, Rolf, do I need to go into crypto? Can you tell me, right? And suddenly my emails are like, I got hundreds of emails. And I'm just one dude, right? If I'm gonna spend time with these people, current students or past students of my university, there's a cost associated with that. They're not paying me, right? And even if I did that, nobody knows. So why would I do that? I mean, I could do it out of goodwill, but at some point, I gotta work. I gotta get my next scholarship, right? And so what I'm trying to tell you is that tokens can help reveal three things, in my opinion, that are powerful. They can reveal hidden value exchanges by making them actually visible. What do I mean? If I have a call with Alice, and I tell her about, oh, I think crypto's great for you, nobody knows. My university doesn't know, nobody else knows. If she gave me some tokens for it, forget the price. The price is not relevant. She gives me a token because it reveals that a value exchange has occurred. Then am I more likely to have a call with Alice or not? I would be. Because I want people to know if I deliver value. Because if I deliver value, nobody knows, then maybe most people think I don't deliver value, right? So tokens can help reveal value that are otherwise hidden. Why does this matter? I'm going to take you all the way to DAOs, right? Tokens here are not pump and dump, not try to sell and make money. It's like, oh, thank you for giving value to me. Rolf receives tokens from Alice. So my business school was called INSEAD. So I get, let's say, INSEAD tokens. I get 10 of them. And then what do I do with them? So I start amassing all these tokens by delivering value to my community, right? It's not traded yet, the token. So I have a 10, I have 20, I have 100 tokens. And what do I do with that? Well, I can go to my university and I can cash it in for what I call excess resources. The classic excess resource in Uber is an empty car seat. The classic excess resource in Airbnb is an empty room. What's the classic excess resource for a university?
Researchers.
Damn, no, not quite. You still have to pay. Empty classroom seats. So if you have a teacher teaching, there's 100 seats in the auditorium, he's teaching 80, there's 20 empty seats. To put another person in there is extremely low cost, right? Now, how do you monetize that? Well, Rolf keeps delivering value to the individual students. He gets tokens in return. Now we know he's delivering value. Great. How do we pay him back? Well, he can cash it in to get a seat in the digital transformation class at INSEAD. I'm not sure I want to take that one, but I can give them my INSEAD tokens back to the university, and I get a seat, and I get to learn in return. What does the university do with these tokens? They give it to the next group of students that come in, because these students need to access the alumni network, people like Rolf. Right? And so every student that comes in gets like 50 tokens from the outset that they can spend based on people that deliver value to them. And if they deliver value to others, they get more tokens. You now have a token economy. right? I don't want to talk about the token economy stuff, although we can if you want. I want to talk about the DAO. What's the organization here? The organization is a university that is the issuer of this money. It is an issue, forget money, it's an issue of an asset that backs the asset by saying, if you come to me and give me this thing, I will give you something in return, which is empty classroom seats. Before the early 1970s, it used to be gold against the US dollar, right? You can exchange many things for it. It doesn't have to be money, or if you come with US dollars to me, I'll give you euros. It doesn't have to be gold. It doesn't have to be empty classroom seats. But DAOs are really, really useful if they use tokens to incentivize valuable activities that wouldn't otherwise occur. And notice that the greatness, I think, of this example of the university is that there is no price involved. It could be valuable to have some of these university tokens because you want to get these classroom seats who are an excess resource. But fundamentally, these things are not trading and they're not being hedged and they're not being collateralized, which is all great, and we can do that too. But it's about how do I take something that has 15 units of value in the university ecosystem today? How do I supercharge that to have 25 units of value so people help each other more? DAOs can take trust from one direction and put it into something else. If we trust things like universities, they can start generating things as a DAO, right, where the community, in this case mostly students and former students, can collectively vote upon the same things that we vote on today. Additional emissions, partnerships, you just go on Snapshot and you can do the same thing, right? But the trust remains that this asset can be exchanged for something, which the university assures in the end, empty classroom seats. So let me just stop here and thank you all, and if you have any questions, let me know.